Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's special SDO session from the Metaverse Standards Forum. I'm Leonard Daly, your moderator for today. Today, Jordan Weissman and Kavya Perlman will be introducing the Responsible Data Governance Standard for Immersive and AI integrated systems. This is special session number 6, and of course, today is the 28th of January. The session organizers for all the special SDO sessions are Thomas Stockhammer and Leonard Daly. And as you can see here, we have 36 registrations as of earlier today. We do expect some more. So Metaverse Standards Forum was formed almost 4 years ago to be an open global platform that will require constellation of interoperability standards. Since we are not an SDO, we coordinate with the standards organizations to develop them and to figure out what needs to be developed. We work in pre-standardization activities. In other words, what needs to be done and identified use cases that need to be created prior to writing standards. And then post-standardization activities, including test beds, plug fests, educational materials, and continuing interaction and open source tool development. The Standards Forum is a unique, neutral, and welcoming venue for the pragmatic cooperation between the standards community and industry. And emphasizing again, we are not a standards organization, so we don't create things for standards, but we develop all the pieces necessary so that somebody else can create them. What is the metaverse? This has been a question that has been asked for a long time. What we are working with is a combination, sort of an onion model, but it actually gets referenced further on. We'll provide infrastructure for multi-user, multi-agent interactions and persistent placement interactions with 3D content in virtual and real spaces. We'll have a slide that covers the graphic better than this one a little bit later. So the spatial web is the third dimension extension of the 2D web, which is everybody's familiar with. And we have the internet as the fundamental communication standards down here at the bottom, with the standard package here, mostly managed by the World Wide Web Consortium. The spatial web comprises, at least what exists in standards form now, multiple different standards, sometimes competing, sometimes conflicting, sometimes very much cooperating. The goal of Metaverse Standards Forum is to develop this column here to be to the same level of quality and expectations as everybody is familiar with in the 2D web. The big point now is that the consumer AR market is really taking off with the wearable glasses and very lightweight compatibility devices. It builds on what has been from the enterprise, which typically requires high bandwidth and controlled environments, such as using the Microsoft HoloLens and other similar types of products. So this is the consumer market here is becoming really big, and you see that it will become bigger than anything else here. And of course, this chart is all sort of conceptual rather than numeric or quantitative based. This is a rather complex chart. And in the graphic here, do not try to understand it, as this is where the presentation will be discussing it, mostly with respect to the movement of data along these arrows. This does show how data moves in response to different requests between AI agents, XR sensors, and spatial computing. But most of the presentation will be referencing how is this data managed as it moves, and then also when it becomes at rest into these various places. So the metaverse, as I said before, is not exactly a tiered model, but the interaction of XR, which is the extended reality piece where you merge in what is physically present with computer-generated material, AI, which everybody at least thinks they know something about, and spatial computing. In this case, we're not solely working with generative AI that responds to human questions. That is going to be a part of it, but a lot of it will be just understanding and pulling up other related material much as you'd find it in a search engine. The Metaverse Standards Forum works in all these domain areas, the indicated by the heavy bold titles above things. But we are reorganizing into a much simpler structure. And if you want to find out more information on that, we have several other presentations and other material that describes what's happening here. But mostly we want you to get involved. So please come visit Metaverse Standards Forum, and you can provide contact here. We accept applications from every organization. There is a fee structure if you wish. There's also a tiered level that allows organizations, whether they're companies, businesses, educational organizations, or nonprofits, standard organizations, to participate for free. So the sessions, which this is part of, is a series where we bring in SDOs to talk about the work that they are doing. There's a number of previous presentation sessions. The next session will have a little more information on a little bit later. The goals to increase the visibility for the standards development process as a whole and for the particular SDO sessions as they present. The intent is to get access to assist and accelerate SDO efforts to get the standards we need. Partially, it's to get feedback from the community who does attend these, and also interact with people from the standard side to see to have them interact more and develop better standards. So again, Q&A time. You can ask your questions at any time during the presentation. You can continue to use Discord during the presentation or afterwards. And this will take you to the Discord page. There's also the link in chat for Discord. So I'd like to introduce our presenters today. First up will be Jordan Weissman. He is Senior Technical Advisor for XRSI. And Kavya Proman, who is the CEO, will join later, primarily during the Q&A session. So go ahead, Jordan.
All right, thank you very much for that, Leonard, and thanks everybody for being here today. As Leonard said, as I'm going through the presentation, feel free to jump in at any point with questions. The goal here is to raise familiarity and encourage interaction and kind of learn more about the standards and kind of go. I tend not to keep an overly formal approach to these kinds of sessions. I suppose it'd be different if we were doing this as a webinar, but really we want involvement here. So what are we here for today? I'm going to introduce you to or reintroduce you to XRSI, and we're going to talk specifically about our newest standard, the Responsible Data Governance Standards, or standard. Specifically, I'll give a quick brief overview about XRSI itself. We'll talk specifically, then we'll move into about the Responsible Data Governance Standard. We'll provide a good overview there. I'll take you through it and show you the different pieces of the standard. Then we're going to spend some time talking about how it overlaps directly with metaverse technologies, so XR, related use of AI, and so on. And then we're going to talk specifically about how RDG may relate to the Metaverse Standards Forum itself and some of the other standards and initiatives that have been developed and supported through the standard to kind of provide some information on where they overlap, where they integrate, and how really they work in a complementary way to support and provide competitive advantage for folks that are looking to do this kind of stuff. We'll talk about that a few times. That advantage piece as we're going through this. So XRSI, who are we? What are we doing here? The X-Reality Safety Intelligence Organization was started back in 2019 as kind of a response to the recognition that metaverse technologies, and even at the time, this is before the broad adoption of artificial intelligence, but when everybody was still focused primarily on spatial computing, or what was now called spatial computing. At the time, we were just talking about VR and AR and other extended reality kind of stuff. But we recognized really that there was something lacking in in terms of oversight and governance and the consumer side, or really the user side of adoption of some of these technologies there. And anybody who had initial experiences in some of the metaverse places, some of the first multi-user environments that people got in VR, for example, some of the rapid expansion and use of AR technologies, especially in public spheres, which we're seeing a lot of now. There was just an article in the BBC last week about surreptitious recording for people that were using AR glasses and kind of the impact that that had on others. Those experiences are what motivated and kind of underscored when Covey decided to found the XR in 2019, because we needed a response to that. And in fact, the very first standard that XRSI developed is the privacy and safety framework. At the time, it was focused primarily on VR. Now it's expanded a bit into other XR and AI technologies. And the version 2 of that standard is actually just about ready to be released. Since we started working on that, we've also released standards related to child safety, or guidelines related to child safety within metaverse computing and exponential technologies. We've got one related to medical safety and medical use within. That's one of the areas where AI has really taken off, especially in terms of training for those kind of systems, as well as things like robotic surgery and that kind of stuff. And today we're going to be talking about our newest standard, which is responsible data governance. So what about, what kind of, got behind XRSI? What are we really trying to aim here, for why are we doing this kind of stuff? And it's really a recognition, as I said, that digital transformation is accelerating. People are adopting these technologies, using these technologies, and there's been a real focus on the innovation side of these things and on getting products into the hands of the people that can do really cool things with them. And there hadn't been enough focus at the time, anyway, on the safety of these technologies in how they're using data, how they're interacting with individuals, and what they're kind of doing with it. And that's where we started. We recognized early on that in an environment where things are changing too fast, or changing very fast anyway, and we'll talk about that in a bit later, that trust itself is a competitive advantage, right? We recognize that people tend to go with what they like, what they're comfortable with, and what they can trust, and that you won't, even if you have the greatest technology in the world, as a lot of our colleagues in maybe some of the VR spaces have recognized, that even if the technology is amazing and capable of great things, if it lacks consumer trust or the idea that it can be a safe place for folks while they're doing this kind of stuff, it's unfortunately not going to go anywhere. At the time when we started down this path, the regulatory landscape across the world was just then beginning to adapt, but it was kind of nascent in how it approached these technologies. Things are a little bit different now in that we have it's still a rapidly changing landscape, but the regulatory environment is changing quite a bit. We have some jurisdictions that are really kind of focused more intensely on trying to ensure there's adequate controls and governance and security and privacy and stuff associated with these technologies. And we have other areas that are kind of stepping back maybe and kind of getting back to let's focus on innovation, and we'll kind of bring the regulations later. And all of that is to say that because these landscapes are changing so quickly and they're a little bit unpredictable, what folks need to succeed in these environments are flexible, reasonable frameworks that can help them meet the regulatory aims, help them meet their strategic innovation and business goals, while allowing them to adequately govern and control this technology as they're rolling it out there, without having to, waste time or money or effort trying to kind of to meet those goals. Anyway, so why XRI standards? Because we created the first global standard for that, PSF. Like I said before, it focused originally on extended reality technologies. That was we started this in 2019. I think the PSF version 1 was released in 2021, if I recall correctly. The idea here also is recognizing that there are a lot of existing technology frameworks and privacy frameworks and kind of standards that can address this kind of stuff, but trying to retrofit old frameworks into new technology while it's rapidly evolving is not usually successful. They weren't really created at a time that really understood the capabilities and the extent of all those technologies. And so what we really needed to provide was modern, flexible frameworks that I said organizations could use in an efficient way. RDG was built from the ground up to recognize and support biometric data. Going back to that initial focus on XR technologies, one of the first kind of shall we say, epiphany moments that we came into as we were developing the standards was the recognition that in VR, when you're using the equipment that lets you participate fully in one of those environments, the data gathered about the individual using the technology is pretty expansive and pretty amazing. It has to know the person's orientation in physical space, where they're looking, where their eyes may be looking, how well they're moving, how quickly they're moving, all sorts of aspects about their person that isn't just classical interaction data and user data related to technology. It's actually biometric physical data about the individual that could be used to extrapolate all sorts of intensely personal information about them. And so that was one of kind of the original focus and stuff. And that also leads to the natural evolution of why today we're going to be talking more about responsible data governance specifically, and not just safety for the technology in general. So why we're here today, let's talk about that, the Responsible Data Governance Standard. One thing I'll point out too, you might have noticed, I tend to talk very fast. I get really excited about this kind of technology and these kinds of things. So if I'm going too fast or you miss something, you want me to repeat something, feel free to throw something at me or ask that as a question also. So what is the Responsible Data Governance Standard? It was the first global standard for extended reality and AI focused specifically on data governance. Not the first standard related to technologies, but the first focusing on data governance. We launched it last year, version 1 last year. The goal was to have an iterative cycle where we would release a new version of the standard with incremental improvements every 6 months to a year. We haven't done one for 2026 yet, obviously, because it's just in January. So the current version is V1. It's available at xrsi.org/RDG if you're interested in the full standard. The standard is comprised of 7 strategic control domains. And within those domains, there are 25, not each, but there are a total of 25 specific requirements aimed towards ensuring that the data captured, used, inferred, computed, and shared related to the use of XR technologies, AI technologies, and so on can be handled in a responsible and appropriate way. The standard is designed to be technology agnostic. However, we have baked in specific controls or specific requirements around the unique aspects of the data as it is handled by extended reality and AI systems, specifically things like that biometric data that I was talking about before. I said inference a little bit ago too, so we're talking about things that AI can determine about these kind of stuff. And we also focus on the idea that the data for AI systems is maybe more complex than what would have been, considered related to classic information technology, where you care about what data is in the system, you care about what data you're adding to the system, and you care about what data comes from it. AI also adds the extra dimensions of the data that the AI models were trained on, as well as data gathered as part of the monitoring processes of how the AI is actually working. So not just metadata related to like the operation of the system, but maybe data related to things like tuning the system and adjusting it over time and that kind of stuff. The goal of the standard also is to be global, or to be flexible enough to be able to integrate with or assist organizations in meeting the requirements of any other compliance standard, even as the regulatory landscape is changing. We'll talk a bit more about that later in terms of what that kind of mapping looks like. But the goal is to provide that flexibility, as I said before, and that easily adoptable framework. So the focus areas for RDG, as I said before, these are kind of some examples. These were the initial focus areas, and we've actually started creating specific technology profiles within RDG. So a perspective of RDG as it would apply towards maybe spatial computing devices and to edge computing devices and to the collection of maybe medical data or social data and that kind of stuff. But the initial focus areas were on that real-time biometric data collection that I talked about before. As you can see, that's been kind of a running thread through a lot of XRSI's work, primarily because it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's one of the perspectives and aspects of the interaction for this stuff that keeps showing up all the time. We're very interested in AI-driven predictive analytics. So there was a lot and is ongoing attempts to integrate AI in terms of rapid decision making and user experience kind of stuff into extended reality technologies, especially in AR these days. And so that kind of brought an extra dimension of a greater volume and complexity of data handling and data processing and data sharing, especially that was became a key focus as we were developing the responsible data governance standard. And there's also the recognition that, whether you use terms like cloud or edge computing or hybrid or anything these days, I mean, really what we have developed and what has kind of emerged across the world is a much more integrated computing environment, and really information processing and data environment that we've ever had in the past. The world is not just more connected now than ever has been. It's more integrated now than it ever has been. No single device, whether you're talking about an individual's phones or laptops or which are all considered subscription devices now, or tablets or wearables or XR devices like headsets or AR devices like glasses. Everything is connected and sharing data, often across borders, across boundaries, and across systems, and with parties that third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties. And the term I often use these days is nth parties, because it's hard to tell how many of their and AI has certainly exacerbated that as it's added multiple more layers of parties to hook on and stuff. So anyway, the point there really is that we recognize that we're dealing with more data than ever before. We're dealing with it in more complex situations than ever before. It's being shared with and transmitted and communicated in more places than ever before. So governance is really more important. A flexible framework for governing that data is more important than it has ever been if we're going to do this successfully, and in a way that still maintains trust, as I was talking about before, as that competitive advantage. So as I said, the Responsible Data Governance Standard is built around 7 primary goals. Those goals are data lifecycle management, and the idea here is that it's complete oversight from data creation through disposal. Role-based accountability, and you notice I said accountability and not access control, which is what most people are familiar with there. And the goal here is that regardless of what access control system you adopt or how you deal with from that perspective of the data, what we care about in terms of data governance is who owns the data, who's handling the data, who's responsible for managing the data, and who has input or cares about how that data is being processed, and making sure that those perspectives are captured, accounted for, and included in the governance framework for how your organization is dealing with data, or how your organization, but I mean, it could be your app, could be your device, could be whatever, right? Process standardization. The goal here really is that we want to encourage the development of uniform procedures, version controlled, with good change management, and not necessarily an overly cumbersome or burden kind of place here, but people who are handling data and interacting with environments need to understand what the expectations are at the current time that they're dealing with that data, so that they can be sure that they're handling it within the expectations of the framework you're dealing with there. And so we have got requirements around that. Third-party governance, as I had before, and maybe we should start calling that nth-party governance. As I said, data is shared, connected with, transmitted to, received from, folks or systems, other organizations, other devices, other services all over the world, in surprising places sometimes when you're acting this stuff. And so really getting a handle around understanding how complex that ecosystem is an important aspect of being able to manage data responsibly, even accounting for the aspect that you may not know where the data is going, because of the nature of the more complex supply chains now. And so being able to have frameworks that deal with that is important. The fifth goal is AI decision-making controls. So as I said before, there's recognition that AI is being integrated into a lot of these technologies and kind of underscores the more complex aspects of data use here. So we have specific requirements around governance of AI system outputs, including things like transparency and accountability and accounting for explainability in terms of automated decision-making and that kind of stuff. The last two are a little bit more classical, kind of regulatory compliance. RDG, the Responsible Data Governance Framework, is an attempt to help unify compliance efforts, to streamline that process and account for the overlapping, sometimes conflicting array of regulations that folks have to handle when dealing with data, whether we're talking about it from a privacy perspective or from a data handling perspective or from a security perspective. And so the goal there is to provide a framework that is flexible enough that you can meet any of those requirements as you go, while only having to worry about one set of standards or requirements, insofar as they're relevant. We'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like. But the goal is to make it easy. We recognize that there's a need to focus on actual governance and the safety of these technologies, but it has to be done in a way that doesn't get in the way of either the end user's experience or the organization's ability to innovate and adopt the new technologies as they're coming out, because the landscape is changing so fast. Getting in the way is really not an option. And finally, continuous improvement. So borrowing a bit from kind of the models of CI/CD, the goal here really is to create a system where you can be focusing on always improving how you're handling data, always improving how you're managing these kinds of systems in ways that can be as automatic and as possible. And this includes things like having dashboards for tracking what you're doing right now, incorporating processes into or incorporating reviews and controls and stuff as part of the automated process you may have for dealing with innovation, application development, device development, and all that kind of stuff. And then validating all that through regular assessments, whether self-assessments or external assessments and that kind of stuff. So let's get a little bit more detail into the goals. I won't spend too much time, going through all of these, but I kind of want to provide more details on each of the individual goals. So let's start with data lifecycle management. So this is also a little bit of a classic kind of compliance thing, in that before you can govern anything, you need to understand what it is you're trying to govern and where it exists within your environment. So a key aspects of the requirement of this particular goal are getting accurate inventories of the data you handle, the metadata, about that data and the other systems involved, and accurately diagramming the flow of that data through, into your environment, through your environment, and out of your environment again. These are the kinds of things that you have to create as part of any compliance standard, any architectural documentation standard, basically any time you need to write down or demonstrate to others how you're dealing with stuff, you need to have these anyway. So we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to create those and get those down on paper. Part of that process involves taking the opportunity to assess the risk to the data or to the individuals the data is about, or to and when I say individuals, because we're talking about data in a broad sense here. It's not just the data subjects aren't just necessarily individual people, but they could be avatars or personas as represented within an XR environment. It could be organizations related to, where you're getting data from, that you're sending data to, or that the data itself is about, depending on kind of the context of your environment. It could be related to device profiles or individual devices or characteristics about those. But the point is to recognize that since we're gathering information around where the data sits, we understand where it goes in the environment, we can start also inventorying at the same time each of the points at which that data may be exposed to misuse, harm, or unintended interactions as we're getting that down. And I think a key aspect of our standard here is performing the risk assessment, but recognizing that while you're determining where the data sits is a really good time to perform some of those initial aspects of a risk assessment, as opposed to trying to bolt it on later after the fact. And another key thing here is this involves classification data as well. So you've documented where it is, where it comes from, where it's going, who's handling it, who's touching it, where it's going, or where it's being sent to. You have started identifying the points at which it may be exposed to, unintended or unexpected or unauthorized uses. And so now you also need to classify that data so that you can determine what controls go later. Classical kind of security and privacy approach to things. Examples of the kind of data we're talking about here that may be unique to XR as opposed to other fields are things like eye tracking, right? So if you're getting a high velocity, dense data, biometric stream that's being used for real-time analytics, being able to recognize that, okay, based on the sensitivity, we need to make sure that it's stored or encrypted at rest, or encrypted in transit, or maybe provided with tighter access controls. And maybe that comes with the consideration for things like, okay, well, we can only share this with third parties if we aggregate the data over time. We're only going to store it for a short period of time to make sure that the risk of harm is really reduced. And we need to make sure that once we're not storing it for secure delete. And those are examples of kind of classical security and privacy approaches to handling the data based on classification. And really, that's the idea that we are ensuring that organizations have plans, documentation, and controls for managing that data across its life cycle before, not trying to do any of it, too far after the fact, like a lot of organizations do. That's a key aspect of this. The second goal, role-based accountability. So we've kind of outlined the idea that, as I said before, every organization handling and operating in these complex environments should have accountability for how the data is being managed in the organization. We've identified 4 classical roles. Anybody who's focused been working in information, I was going to say information technology, but really we're talking about everything from security to information theory and that kind of stuff here. There's kind of those recurring roles that show up in most environment, which is there's who owns the data, in other words, who's ultimately responsible for how it's being dealt with. There's who handles the data or is responsible for the day-to-day operation of data, the stewards, data custodians, the folks who manage the data over time, as well as the folks that actually use the data to do their job. And these are the primary roles. I think whether you add roles here, you'll notice one role may be missing, which that is the data subjects themselves. And I think whether you add that as a role for accountability or not depends upon the use cases of the data within your environment. But the considerations of that should always be part of something that these other 4 roles deal with here. But the idea is that you create and who these groups are. And again, it's not just limited to these, but we want to make sure that somebody ultimately is accountable for the data that's flowing through the environment, being received by the environment, being transmitted out of the environment, and being processed or handled, that is handled within the environment. And part of our requirements also is not just defining these roles on paper, but implementing accountability for the data itself, both administratively and technically based on the data's classification. So this could be things like implementing automated controls around encryption to ensure that if the data is sensitive enough that it needs to be encrypted, at rest or in transit, that you have controls in place to do that in a way that means the only way to handle that data within your environment is according to the security requirements, the sensitivity of that data. Maybe this includes things like if you need regular acquisition of and verification of consent to process the different individual, that you have an automated process for getting the consent in the first place, ensuring the consent is up to date, and asking for it again if either the consent that you already received expired, or you've identified that there are new use cases for that data which you didn't get consent for and you need an automated process to go back out to the user and say, hey, we'd like to use the data we got about you for something else now. Is that still okay with you? And we focus there on automation primarily because, as I said before, the idea of this framework is to not get in the way of innovation and the operation of the system. So we want to introduce as few roadblocks as possible, and automation is one way to kind of make that easier on everybody, especially the users of the technology. Process standardization. And this is kind of a classic, goal maybe for everybody out there dealing with technology. But what we're really looking for here is that in order for the framework to be flexible, we need to aim for the lowest common denominators. In other words, what processes are reusable across an organization, across technologies, across time? How do we make sure that the processes themselves don't need to be unique to every single instance or iteration of the data that we're handling? And where we do need uniqueness, where can we introduce, again, automation or other similar aspects like that, maybe pipeline integration or something else, so that we can achieve standardization of processes, or at least the adoption of compliant processes in a way that doesn't get in the way of innovation, the use of or the adoption of the technology, or really the users who are trying to use that technology. Part of the things here are interestingly some things that I would consider on the perennial wish list for any assessor or compliance team anyway, but there are things that we recognize, and we include in the framework because they will assist the technology teams and the business teams that are developing this technology. And that's things like version control for documentation. Have an easy way to know which document is the current document, which is the one that we need to be following right now, and which one has been reviewed most recently, handled with. Automating that as best as possible, maybe integrating your policies as Git repositories or something can be really handy for that. There are requirements around specific policies, since we're talking about data governance here, around not just general policies for data handling, but things like how are we maintaining data quality? How are we maintaining data integrity over time? How are we ensuring that those requirements for quality and integrity are being promulgated to the individuals that we're sharing data with or getting data from, and that there are clear mechanisms for error reporting. This is something that overlaps with a lot of privacy requirements out there, but the goal is that if we're gathering all this data about individuals to be using in real time with XR technologies and AI technologies, there's a real need to make sure that the data we're getting is accurate, especially if we're going to be using it for decision making or decision support processes, or some of that rapid response kind of stuff that AI at Edge has enabled. Data accuracy is really, really important. So it needs to be a way for really anyone to ask for correction or update or fixing problems related to the data itself. And there should be reporting mechanisms for the individuals the data is about, the users within the system, but it also needs to be part of the development backend management systems as well too. The fourth goal, third-party governance or nth party, as I said before. These systems are incredibly complex. Everybody is here. So real quick, we have a question that showed up in the chat. Is RDG based on other standards or other types of data? If so, which ones? What were the inspirations for it? So the short answer to that question is it borrows and is inspired a lot by other standards. You've heard me mention security and privacy standards a few times, as well as some other kind of business things there. And it is itself recognition of the fact that maybe those standards are too narrow or focused in domain or something else, kind of like that. So we came up with this more broad standard in terms of data types. So the responsible data governance standard is designed to be general enough or agnostic enough, not to necessarily care about the specific data, but provide a framework for governing that data, regardless of where it comes from, the type of data that it is, or the specific technical requirements of the systems in which the data is used. Does that help answer the question there? So, we'll talk a little bit later about kind of what some of that overlap with other standards might look like. But the goal here really is to recognize that, I guess, two things. One, there's a lot more data in a lot more complex ways being gathered and used with experiential systems and with extended reality systems and with AI than has been done in the past. So there's a greater need to management. And two, a lot of the existing standards and regulations out there look at it from a specific point of view. And so there's a need to integrate and deconflict those standards a little bit, which we're kind of aiming to be that more overarching standard so that you can have a framework to adhere to that'll help you meet those other standards without needing to turn each one into a separate science project is kind of the goal there. So like I said, we'll talk about the specific overlap in a bit, but I hope I answered your question there, Alfred. So going back to third-party data governance here. So as I said before, related to the use of extended reality systems and AI systems, there's a greater volume of data, a greater velocity of that data moving around, and there's a lot more other organizations involved. It's not just third parties. It's not just the hosting system that your platforms are living on, or the manufacturer of the device that you're using to deal with that data, or the immediate partners that you're sharing that data with. But there's also, like, especially in terms of AI, right? So let's say you get an AI model from a third-party company. You have to have a relationship with the company that's providing you the model. But a lot of those companies didn't actually do, especially if we're talking about integration with foundational models, they didn't necessarily do the training of the model itself. So there's another company involved. There's companies involved monitoring that training data, handling the stuff that's going on there. There's maybe even more companies involved for things like moderation and oversight and guardrails. And it can be a much more complex web of third, fourth, fifth, sixth, many, many layers of extra parties there. And so you have to have a way for dealing with it. So we've created requirements around not necessarily completely solving the problem, but encouraging an organization and providing guidance for solving that problem as it's relevant for your individual use case or environment or organization itself. Again, this involves ensuring that the data flow diagrams we talked about before also identify all of the external sharing data flows, ins, outs, using the data throughout the system there, that there's clear vetting processes for vendors and assessing them even on a regular basis, that there's continuous monitoring. And that one of the things that we really wanted to focus on too is not just the idea that you have data sharing or cross-border, data agreements with the organizations that you're sharing or getting data with or getting data from, but those agreements include clear accountability and understanding for what the requirements are. So this is one of those areas where if you have a certain set of regulations you have to meet and or expectations communicated to users and customers and partners that you need to meet related data, that's clear within your agreements, and that it gets negotiated and deconflicted with the organizations that you're sharing data with to make sure that there is no ambiguity on who's responsible for which aspects of the data and its use and where it goes. Hey, I see Kavya's joined us and she's answering some of the questions as well during the chat. Thanks, Kavya. And part of that came out of the fact that as we've been, and as anybody who's gone through, privacy and security or usability assessments and stuff with other places, while a lot of requirements like GDPR require those kind of data sharing agreements already, and there are model clauses that cover that kind of stuff, they're not always necessary. They don't always address it from an accountability or responsibility perspective. They focus it primarily on a control perspective related to individual aspects of data itself. And so we're trying to answer that with a broader framework to ensure that when it comes down to it, there's less questions that need to be asked around how the data is being managed with third parties that's being acquired from or being shared with, and all that gets back to, as I said before, not getting in the way of innovation or adoption or safe use of these technologies. The fifth goal, AI decision controls. So this is really kind of focusing on that fact that AI is being integrated into how these systems work, and AI operates on and cares mostly about and focuses a lot on data. So the requirements we have under this goal are policies for the use of AI, especially things like model versioning and lineage, know which model you're using, know what its limits and capabilities are, know where it came from, and what the training incorporations were, especially in terms of model behavior and output. As models are becoming more interconnected these days, and we've enabled things like tool use and reaching out to external systems and even potentially embedding volition in the model to do that kind of stuff as part of what it sees as its process. What it sees. I don't want to personify the models, but the idea here is that you can embed, get a model to say, hey, if you can reach out, to use tools or something, here's the mechanism in which you do it. And that also means that they can be made to do that automatically. So know where they came from and know what the interests and expectations and kind of perceptions of the suppliers of the model are. Have protocols for dealing with AI outputs. And these are things like explainability, especially when we're talking about decision-supported decision-making, things like bias management, that kind of stuff as well, incorporate as part of your process. I would say maybe it's relevant too there to have processes for, this is a little outside, just data governance, but, things like over-reliance on the models as well too. In other words, if we're already having to make sure that we can explain the decisions, and the output that's coming from a model, or that we're adjusting it for bias, we also need to have mechanisms for ensuring that there's not too many processes that can't be done without the model's involvement, as we're trying to keep humans in the loop for across these processes and stuff. And also have logging of those interactions. What's going into the model, what's coming out of the model, insofar as we can, what the model's doing with that data, what your confidence is in the model's ability for consistency or adherence to the necessary, expectations and controls and guardrails that are put in place. And then, of course, what's coming out of the model as well, too. Examples of that might be if AI is being used as part of an augmented reality navigation system. Maybe we need logging data related to the routes that are recommended and changes to the routes that are put in place with the reasoning that the model used to come up with those routes. And maybe even providing opportunity for the user to say, hey, why this route? And I think that's an aspect that may be unique to AR-assisted navigation things that are lacking from people using, Google Maps or Apple Maps or something to navigate around now, is that you get there's a route planning algorithm in the thing that may come up with how to get somebody from point A to point B, but it doesn't provide that interactivity where the user can ask, why did you send me down that route? Why aren't there other routes, alternative? Hey, I'd like to stop somewhere else. What are the various ways of getting that kind of stuff? As we're integrating AI into systems to provide those kind of features and make these things more usable for individuals, we also need more support behind that kind of stuff to determine how the model is working, how its interactions are going, and to ensure, like I said before, adherence to guardrails and that kind of stuff. And so integrating requirements or having requirements here around controls for around AI decision making is kind of the main part of this process here, because we recognize, like in that example, that the use of AI to augment the capabilities of these systems is a natural, step for integration into XR technologies, as it has been to everything else. And so it's going to be a key aspect of dealing with all this, especially where the large volumes of data and stuff are concerned. Regulatory compliance, goal number 6. So here are kind of some of those classical things I mentioned before. Know what regulations are coming, know what which jurisdictions are touched by, or which jurisdictions and industries and interested parties and stuff are implicated by your use of the technologies, where you operate and what data you're grabbing from it, and then have a process for mapping that compliance matrix to individual requirements. RDG itself has comes with some of that mapping and helps simplify that process. And really what we're getting at here isn't to say that we're going to solve that process or that potential problem for you in terms of where all the things overlap, but we recognize that it is such an important aspect of adequately governing the data that you're dealing with that you should have a mechanism for doing that yourself, or doing that within the environment, whether it's based on the framework included within within this standard itself, or you're doing it somewhere else. It matters more to us, or more to RDG specifically, that you are in fact doing that, so that you know what the responsibilities are, where you need to be handling with all that kind of data. And that's especially important related to international data transfers, because that rapidly changing regulatory landscape I was talking about before. This has been kind of a moving target for years, as anybody who's followed the discussions around the privacy shield and kind of what's become of that changes now in both the American market as well as the Canadian market, and in Europe with the adoption of NIS2 and that kind of stuff, as well as the passage of PIPA in China and so on. So it's a changing landscape. You need to have a way of dealing with it. And really, this is probably the first standard to say, hey, this isn't just something you need to be aware of and something that you should have a good process for. Your compliance folks probably already have tried to do this somewhat, but this is the first standard to say, no, you need to be doing this, and let's make sure that it is in place in a sustainable way. And finally, the 7th goal, continuous improvement. So as I said before, we're borrowing a bit here from maybe development processes, but the goal here is to integrate is to ensure that you're always attempting to do better and improve and continuously monitor kind of what you're doing around the governance of data, and that you can rely on or integrate automation into that as much as possible, both to make it easier to do, but also to ensure that it actually does happen as it is required to do, especially for periodic kind of stuff. So this is identifying, key performance indicators or key results and outcomes indicators. So you're talking about KPIs or KROs, that you identify what they are, that you know what it is that you should be measuring, and that you have in fact aspects for doing that. It's not just important on the business side of things, but it's important across all the technology and side of stuff, where you're putting in systems to do any kind of monitoring. You need to be knowing what you're monitoring for and what means something is going awry. There should be regular updates to your data flow diagrams and documentation. I mean, we talked before about needing to inventory that, about how you can't really govern something that you don't have awareness of, or that you don't know as part of your environment. And so we also recognize that's not just a one-time thing. The data that you're dealing with and how you're processing it and what you're doing with it, where you're getting it from, where it's going, and all that changes over time. So you need to have updates, that same documentation, to ensure that what you're doing and that your ability to govern it also is kept up to date. And that might include regular assessments of, the impacts to the privacy impacts of that information, or the compliance related to that information, or the security of that information, or the risks, points of exposure for that information we talked about before, even more fundamental aspects like the metadata about that information, right? So are you gathering more data elements than you have before? Have your uses of that information changed over time? Are you inferring new things from that data that mean you've changed the classifications that you grab? All that kind of stuff needs to be asked for on a regular basis. Now look at there's another question chat here. Do you make any reference to a use of data maturity modeling frameworks such as EDMA's DCAM? Yes, to a point that if those are aspects that are relevant to your organization, in terms of your industry, your domain, the data that you're dealing with, you should have a mechanism for dealing with it. RDG itself is a framework, so it's not focused on the maturity of your data management, but that the improvement of that maturity or that the elements related to it that matter to your business are included in your governance framework. So we're maybe a bit more meta in terms of that's concerned. It's relevant, definitely, but there's not a RDG itself doesn't include requirements around or necessarily a measurement of your maturity for doing that kind of stuff. All right. So that was an overview of the standard itself. So now let's talk a bit about responsible data governance and its application to XR technologies, at the heart of new digital worlds. So specifically related to computing relevance here. So distributed processing creates governance challenges. For example, maintaining that data lineage we've talked about before, managing that data as moving across places, especially if it's going out to the edge, whether we're talking about remote devices that lack ubiquitous or reliable internet connectivity, or maybe we just need faster processing for things, some of the data being captured for things like the user's orientation in physical space and VR space and that kind of stuff. So it's happening on the device instead of in the cloud. Anyway, it complicates where the data is, so that those aspects need to be incorporated into your governance of the data and your recognition of where it sits and that kind of stuff. Real-time decision making means AI systems at the edge need governance frameworks that work at speed. If we're pushing more data out there and there's a greater velocity and greater volume of that kind of data, that decision making needs to happen quickly. And so the frameworks that govern that decision making also need to be able to exist in those same edge environments as well too. And it goes back to, like I said before, where we're really kind of leaning a lot on the use of automation and technical controls related to some of that data, because that's the only way to ensure that the governance frameworks that you have created to manage the data that you're dealing with happen even regardless of where your processes and systems are running. In other words, it can't be just based on human decision making, and it can't be just based on some committee back in the office that makes a more broader decision that's supposed to be carried forward to the teams that develop technology. It has to be baked into the technology, on device, on system, at the point the data is being used, to ensure that those requirements and controls within the framework itself are being adhered to. And finally, that kind of gets back to the idea is that one of the things that we recognized when we first started heading down this path originally was that classical data governance or classical governance frameworks at all kind of relied more on that human aspect of decision making, and it was looked at as more of a planning kind of stuff. And we recognized that based on the volume, the frequency, the velocity, and those points at which the data is being used, that's just not scalable or sustainable anymore. That governance actually has to be pushed, to where the data is being dealt with at the point it's being dealt with. We have another question in the chat. It says, does RDG allow the end user providing the data to be the data owner? So the short answer to that question is absolutely. As I said, when we were talking about role-based accountability, who sits in the roles and how the roles are defined, RDG as part of the framework recognizes that those 4 roles and potentially more, as I was talking about before, are relevant to how you govern data, but we're not prescriptive about who sits necessarily in those roles. So the owner of the data doesn't necessarily have to be, it could be the person supplying the data, it could be the person receiving the data, it could be the organization inferring the data based on information that's gathered elsewhere. Our point in the standard is that you have to identify who the owner of that data is and what their responsibilities and capabilities related to governing that data as the owner are concerned. But yeah, absolutely. They can be, who actually sits in those roles is entirely up to the specifics around the use case or the environment or the system in which you're developing. So yeah, it could be the end user, it could be the data subject, it could be, someone else that's receiving the data or responsible for dealing with the data, depending on context. So there's overlap with not just, XR stuff, but maybe there's some, unique things around civil AR. So there's a lot of initiatives these days around, we've kind of switched a little bit from focusing on fully virtual worlds to, there's a greater incidence now or a greater I would say attention maybe to the use of augmented reality with things like glasses, and maybe how we can integrate that from a civil standpoint. And this means that data is crossing maybe some interesting boundaries in that scenario. So if we're providing maybe public services or systems, infrastructure connected systems related to the use of augmented reality to help folks identify, navigate around town, use public transit, explore a museum or a point of interest or something like that in a way that they can do, self-guided or system-guided kind of interactions. That often involves needing, high-speed data access wirelessly. So whether that's, local Wi-Fi or 5G connected devices or something like that, you're going to have a lot of third-party, fourth-party, fifth-party systems helping to support that system. And it's recognition here that a given municipality or organization or government that wants to provide those kind of services is probably using technology platform services and is integrated with things entities who exist outside of their home jurisdiction and possibly outside of their political and geographic borders. And so when you're integrating these systems, you maybe work for, a city who wants to create an easier way. So as an example, I worked with, I was in Germany a couple of months ago, and there's a really cool system around Dresden where we were called Fartic, where if we wanted to use the mass transit system around there, we had the app on our phone. It knew when you were near a local tram stop. You'd said, hey, I'm starting a journey now. You got on the trams, you took as many trams or buses as you need. And when you got off, you said, I'm all done. And then it calculated your fare based on knowing where you were, what you traveled, all that kind of stuff. A really clear, cool, simple aspect for AR technologies. But it meant that interaction didn't just involve the local, municipal transit systems as part of DVR there in Dresden. Fartic itself is a European country based, I think they're in the Netherlands. There was payment application involved that was for payment processors elsewhere in Europe. I'm a U.S. citizen when I was there. The payments that I was using come back to banks that are here in the U.S. And it's just recognizing that simple, cool, incredibly useful AR technology involved aspects of data sharing and elements and that kind of stuff that involved multiple countries, both in and outside the EU at the time, as well as sharing that data kind of all over the place, and all based on easy access cellular technology. So knowing what data was being gathered, how to govern that data, having to know what the requirements were of all that is a lot more complicated than just what you would think would be involved for that local municipal transit system, trying to help the typically local residents there within the environment that they're dealing with. Technical benefits. So yes, this is a compliance framework or a governance framework, but we also want to illustrate for folks that the adoption and adherence of a framework like this provides benefits to organization beyond just meeting the needs, the compliance needs here. And that's kind of recognizing that we have been doing, a lot of the folks at XRSI have been on the compliance side at other organizations and recognize the pains of dealing with all that. So one of the things that we baked into this standard, and really to all our standards, is an easy way to identify how what you're producing as part of your attempt to meet the compliance schemes. All right, I apologize. Sorry about that. So anyway, we recognize that there's a lot of artifacts, processes, information, documentation that gets developed as part of your compliance process that is useful for other purposes. And so really this is kind of like, hey, meeting our standard helps you meet other things, helps provide justifications and reasons to the teams about why they really should be involved with this kind of stuff. And we just want to point that out here. This is something that applies to lots of standards. I just want to illustrate the fact that when we created RDG, we recognized that these kind of aspects and wanted to make sure that they were not just a side effect of the framework, but that the awareness of it was baked in the framework. So this means things like, data flow diagrams and inventories, things that need to be created for multiple other reasons anyway, that need to be kept up to date and made accurate for multiple other reasons. Adhering to this framework is going to give you those so you'll be able to use them else you need to. It's also going to identify maybe more of the third parties that you were dealing with before than you hadn't really realized, because it's not just the folks that you're directly buying services from, but we really care about the entire ecosystem of where the data is coming from, handled by, flowing to, and so on. It's going to help you identify endpoints for the individual APIs for where you're dealing with the data, the individual systems that are touching it, so you can ensure not just that they're governed, but that you'll have a more complete inventory of that. As I said before, we want to rely on automation wherever possible, mostly to make it easier for everybody, but that also means that you have the impetus and the opportunity to incorporate and develop a lot of automation to make sure that it gets put in place. And that there's ways of helping to integrate a lot of information, both through the automation and through the fact that the information will exist with other applications, other security and privacy and monitoring and maybe performance monitoring tools, as excuse me, as well as GRC systems kind of generally. As I said before too, one of the things that RDG really aims to do is to deconflict and simplify standards alignment. I will admit that this table, RDG has a few that they're already looking at kind of where our standard overlaps with other standards out there too. I quickly created this one in preparation for this talk and a couple others. I haven't fully vetted the mapping of these, but the goal here really is to is to help illustrate within the RDG goals and the individual requirements. There is a recognition that RDG complements, overlaps with, and integrates well with a lot of the other standards, regulations, and requirements that organizations may have. And so this is an opportunity to show you where our framework is general enough to where if you're meeting our framework and you're achieving compliance with our requirements, even if you're going after certification, which we'll talk about in a second, that it can help illustrate where you're already meeting or that you're producing the artifacts needed to demonstrate alignment with, your information security management system in ISO 27001, or your alignment with the NIST, with the functions and categories within the NIST risk management framework. I guess really that's actually should be the security, the cybersecurity framework. That you're meeting the specific requirements outlined in the articles of GDPR or CCPA or PIPEDA or APA or whatever other privacy regulation that you need to meet there, and where they overlap with other industry recognized and relevant domains, even if they themselves aren't standards that you have to meet. There's still overlap there, which can help kind of illuminate how you're meeting some of the expectations and maybe where you're going to be aligning with emerging standards and stuff over time. So again, like I said, this table is just an example of that. Don't necessarily take it as gospel, but it should help kind of illustrate the expectation a little bit. So I talked before about certification. So XRSI has partnered with Corollary as the initial certification body for RDG. So our goal for this standard is to actually create not just a framework for governing the data, but an actual certification and trust mark that organizations can use to say, hey, look, our governance of this data has been validated by a trusted third party, to help really lean into that idea of using trust as a competitive advantage. It kind of gets away from that classic problem of, most organizations, data governance, privacy, sometimes security, and handling procedures and how they communicate that to the public or other interested parties, whether it's their users, whether it's the public itself, whether it's their partners. It's kind of fallen back into that just trust me model. We'll do the right thing. We'll adequately manage and govern data. Just trust us. We've got this. And that's the reason that we keep going back to that model. Is it gets back to that whole idea of not getting in the way of innovation, needing to be able to rapidly adapt to changing landscapes, changing markets, changing expectations, and kind of move there. But we need to get to the point where we actually have trusted third parties who can validate that organizations really are doing what's expected while they're doing the rapid innovation. And that was kind of one of the expectations while we created that process here. It's a relatively typical certification process. You start by getting the standard, and you can have a toolkit for doing self-assessment and self-alignment. You can work with some of our, some of the corollary experts or some RDG advisors like us to kind of formalize that process and make sure that you're really aligned and ready for it. And then there's a formal certification process itself. We have some comments. Another question in the chat here. The metaverse is the next incarnation of digital world. Is the future. How should we address this crisis and get the metaverse? So Chad's asking about a public crisis and confidence about system of governance technology. Chad, you took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly what we're describing right here. And I think getting back to that trusted third party and that idea that um, not signals, but signs of trust that can get out there and provide that ways of So classical technology, and it's ironic that a lot of the browsers are moving away from it now. But there was the adoption by I would say just IETF and some of the other groups out there, but it was actually multiple standards organizations and the companies behind the browsers. But back when we needed to get people, the public, the average consumer, to recognize that their connection with an individual website is secure and trusted, we implemented, secure sockets layer and now transport layer security protocols for doing that, and we created in the browser the padlock icon that became well known. It took a little while, but it became known as kind of like, here is how you know that your connection to this website is not going to unduly expose your sensitive information, to unintended parties and that kind of stuff. Yes, the realities around that are far more complicated, and it wasn't the only solution. But the point there really is that we created that process built around third-party validation of identity and to a lesser extent, some of the cryptographic standards in there built around the PKI systems. We created a way that communicates that trust and that idea that the connection was secure through the padlock icon in the browser. RDG wants to do something very, very similar related to data governance, and that's we have certification, and we're building an ecosystem around having that trust mark and being able to make it available in verse, in experience, in applications, and at points where individuals can see it to recognize that, hey, this app, this system, this organization that I'm interacting with has been validated that they responsibly govern the data that they deal with, so I can be more comfortable sharing my data with them. I think the closest maybe actual um, uh, alignment with other scenarios now is probably in either in the payment space when you see the PCI logo for organizations that are PCI compliant, or in healthcare, at least in the US, where you see how every organization is claiming to be HIPAA compliant because those terms HIPAA and PCI and stuff carry a certain level of trust to them. Kavi, I see you got your hand up. You wanna add something to the conversation here?
Yeah, no, I have just a tiny bit of opportunity. Hello, everybody. And, this reflection right here is so literally why RDG exists. So I think I'll take the opportunity to just briefly talk about where I come from. So back in, 2018, GDPR is coming about. I'm handling all the systems of Linden Labs, Second Life, moving on to the cloud, lots of unstructured 16-year-old stuff, legacy data. Then I was, and before that, I was at Meta doing third-party compliance or advisory for during the 2016 US presidential election time. Every time these really amazing circumstances happened, and I was managing another new virtual world that was emerging, CNSR. So the every time a third party walked in, whether it is mom pop shop or a Cambridge Analytica style third party through the front door, the first question we asked back in 2016, it should have been asking until today, is do you even have a handle on that data? And truth be told, we ourselves did not. Well, now the world knows. And then when I moved on to Linden Lab, and when the regulatory people said, hey, we need to facilitate these rights to our people, we had so much unstructured data, we didn't know what the hell to do. So the first thing we did is using a bunch of tools, classify all of that, organize. And so it became very clear, just this previous reflection says, at the heart of trust is really the data. If a company, I don't care, it's a mom pop shop or it's a big massive corporation, OpenAI, you name whoever, they can do however many congressional hearing, but for the first time in history, we have technologies that would literally allow, facilitate, and uh, show individual end user how precisely their inferences, their data is being used by any and everybody. Yet what they choose to show us, a panda can fly and whatever else fancy stuff on their on their presentation for launches. So this is where I would love to see a world. This is the vision of RDG, is where every organization puts their foot forward first, as this is what responsible means. Responsible literally means that we've got a handle on the data. Now, pay attention to this is not, and how many times has Jordan said privacy or security? No, not that much, because it is decoupled from that aspect of protection. It is literally about, do you even have a handle on that data? So, in a very high speed, immersive world, over time, individuals should retain this sort of a trust mark in their mind because they're going at like super high speed, going from one experience to another. They should be able to retain this idea of kind of like a, how do we drive on a super highway, highway or information super highway? How would we go? We take that sort of a model of like, hey, this is risky because I don't see any trust mark here, so I'm gonna assume that this augmented reality experience is obviously not being validated by certain standard bodies for the data. That's the minimum trust baseline. And once we get to this part, we can go further, that it becomes users can demand, well, you know what, Meta, I'm sorry, you don't have RDG standards. We're actually not interested in participating in this. And you just check out, log out, or you just don't let your kid into that one because the data is at risk. And it's an obvious indicator. So just, I wanted to take the opportunity to just really go back to what this inspiration, where it comes from. And on the organization side, you could get so much more sophisticated. You could automate the hell out of it to ensure that you have literally won the trust of your individual users that are stepping into AI wearables, that are stepping into surgical glasses. They just see right there, okay, there is an actual consortium that's making sure at any given point, that's the continuous monitoring. This organization is making sure that every possible inference, the EMG, the EKG, and all this kind of data is literally being handled responsibly. And that's kind of what it means. I'll stop there, Jordan, but thank you for allowing me to do that.
Oh yeah, exactly, and great points. I kind of laughed. I haven't said maybe security and privacy as much during this conversation as I would elsewhere. I've lived in that space for almost 30 years, but there is a reason too that there's a lot of overlap there, and I think it's an important aspect of RDG and the way we built the framework is that is intended to be a general framework to help meet those goals and help communicate how your organization is meeting at the end of the day why it can be trusted with the data that it's handling from the perspectives of the individuals the data is about, the individuals supplying the data, the individuals you're sharing the data with, and so on, in a way that is verifiable, not because it's about the specific elements of data or because it's about necessarily a security and privacy thing, but frankly because it's the right thing to do, but also doing it in a way that is not just morally acceptable, but is strategically acceptable because we want to make we want to reduce the burden to implementing the framework as much as possible, relying on things like automation and baking it into the processes and kind of getting back to, for a long time, most folks in the technology world and business world focused a lot on lean processes and trying to copy the Toyota model. And a key aspect of that is making the requirements for doing something in a so-called lean or efficient or correct way, the only way to do it. And now we're talking about doing that same thing with data governance. If the only way to receive the data, process the data, handle the data, store the data, transmit the data, share the data is safely, is in a well-governed way, then you don't have to worry about, compliance or security or privacy because it's already handled, because you bake the framework into your systems, technically, administratively, by through automation, whatever else I can. And that's kind of really what we see as the ideal implementation for some of this kind of stuff. So let's talk. Oops, I'm jumped too far. Let's talk about kind of next steps for as part of the certification process. Just a quick couple of things here. Example evidence that would be looked for as part of the process. And this kind of gives you an idea within the standards perspective about the kinds of things, not just that would be produced as part of the process, but that the kinds of ways that it would be included within the architectures of systems, whether it's part of development, part of integration, part of deployment, part of operation, and even potentially part of decommission and so on, but that we need to look at data inventories, data flow diagrams, the actual roles and configurations and logging information identifies, the accountability associated with the controls. Again, RBAC, I said before that we weren't talking specifically access controls, but whether you're talking about responsible, or role-based accountability and role-based access control, there's a lot of overlap there with those acronyms, as there are so many acronyms in our field. We expect to see standard operation, procedures, ideally, fully versioned and published and findable in places where people need to see it. We need to see those specific policies around data quality, data integrity, data accuracy, and not just data handling and classification we talked about before. We want to make sure that contracts and assessments of vendors are not just performed, but that they include that clear recognition of, communication of, and acceptance of the specific responsibilities that are involved, and that the ecosystem is mapped out as complete as it can be. We also recognize that you may not know who all of the third parties your suppliers are dealing with, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't ensure they're managing them appropriately through your agreements and stuff with them. It's recognizing that it's not just a transient thing, but it's a bit of a fuzzier edge that we've had to deal with in the past, and so we need to have a framework for baked into the framework anyway is aspects of recognizing and controlling for that. You need to have specific. There are specific requirements around the AI, more uniquely AI aspects of data governance that are so important. I mean, not just inputs, outputs, and stored, of course, but also training, tuning, monitoring, and so on related to the data that's being involved there. That compliance matrix, making sure that you've fully mapped out all of the regs and that you've identified, what the expectations are within the jurisdictions and expectations and industries and stuff that you're dealing with data are, and that you've kind of mapped out what those are, and that you're aware of how that may be changing, and maybe even doing that. There's a little bit of aspect there about doing kind of what ifs. In other words, here's how the regulatory landscape or the requirement landscape looks today, but here's what might be coming in a year. If so, Canada, for example, had two different regulations, and both of them unfortunately got stalled in committee, but they were going to create a specific set of regulations around the safe use of artificial intelligence, and they were also going to update their own privacy law called PIPEDA, to a version 2 that was modeled much more closely after GDPR. Those efforts died a little bit, but they haven't gone away, and they're going to keep trying. And specific provinces within Canada have kind of stepped up their own efforts there, including BC, Alberta, and I forgot the other two, but also specifically Quebec that has some added kind of weight there related to privacy controls. But it's recognizing really that as the landscape is changing, you should be aware of how it's going to evolve in the areas that matter to you, and make sure that that's mapped out so you can be proactively ready for and aware of where you're already complying with whatever those new requirements are going to be. And finally, goal 7 there, have not just recognize what the metrics you need to follow are and have dashboards for doing that, but try to integrate them as much as you can in automated processes so that you can be gathering the data in real time on the fly, and so you can have it a moment's kind of an instantaneous idea of where you're sitting and how you're hearing with frameworks as much as possible, based on all the automation stuff that we've already talked about before. Technical artifacts that can be created, as part of this that are just worth recognizing. You probably already have these kind of things that can help, contribute towards how you're meeting, the RDG framework, but maybe also these are things that RDG provides you an opportunity to create. So because you need it for other reasons or useful elsewhere, but these would be kind of things that we'd be looking for, or that the certification bodies like Colorado would be looking for: network diagrams, database schemas, so on. Configuration-related information, maybe it's access controls that tie back to that responsibility, and maybe it's RACI matrix, maybe it's how your logging is configured, are you actually doing it? Encryption settings, looking at not just that encryption is enabled, but that it's configured in a way that is as future-proof as possible, especially as we're having conversations around things like post-quantum cryptography and newer key strengths and that kind of stuff. Do you have, are you baking, and the code that you've got, are you baking access controls and framework and those kind of exposure points for the data into infrastructure as code, descriptions and that kind of stuff? Where does it live? How much automation, how much have you built into your systems around doing this kind of stuff? And then, of course, the operational things that get created or that would be gathered as part of these processes: access logs, incident logs, chain tickets, kind of the usual process and stuff there. But as said before, the goal here really of all of this is to create that network of trust, create that independent third party that people can see that trust mark to say, hey, this organization's RDG certified. We know that they're doing with our data what they claim they're doing with our data. We know that they have a ways for governing this, even if they start doing new things with the data. We know that we can trust that what we expect and have been told is going on is in fact what is happening with the data there. And that our ultimate vision for all this is that it does become, as Kavya said, the mark would be out there as the thing people see and trust and are more willing to engage with systems and applications and in companies that have the certification applied to their products or their company or their processes or whatever's relevant within the idea there. But that they would be less willing to work with people who don't, and that as this becomes more of a broader, a broader adoption, that we'll be developing ecosystems around it. That just like those other trust marks we talked about before, the PCI logo, the padlock in the browser, those other terms that we can help start trying to address some of those widespread disillusionment and distrust and some of the issues that are happening out there right now, where business partners and companies and people doing development, don't feel that they can trust the organizations that they're interacting with. End users can't trust that these organizations are going to treat their data with care, and it's just kind of a mess right now. And we're not the only organization trying to solve that problem, but we definitely think we have a good way to approach it that won't also get in the way of continuing to develop and adapt that technology as we go. So let's talk specifically about RDG and its kind of relationship with the standards forum itself, as well as some of the other SDOs out there and the standards that they've created, and kind of where we see us as being overlapping and complementary to that. We're at the threat. This slide's been around for a little while in a few of these talks that we've given. That we're at the threshold of ubiquitous immersive computing. I would say we're well past the threshold. I mean, this is a common thing every day. In fact, one of the primary frustrations that I personally have with a lot of newer technology that leads to some of that disillusionment stuff is the idea that a lot of product teams assume that all your devices, your wearables, your phones, your laptops, your car, your fridge is always connected to a high-speed internet access, and that a lot of the capabilities of those systems can be pushed to the cloud. We all know that can be problematic, especially from a technology standpoint, and that what happens when the machines, lose access to the cloud, and how does that affect their operability? An interesting story that happened I think it was just last Christmas. There was a company making smart beds that had their beds were designed for better sleep. You could control the temperature and adjust the shape of the bed, recline or sit up and that kind of stuff. They hadn't baked into a default safe starting point for their system. So when we had an outage, I think it was AWS that went down at the time, that company's beds lost the ability to control temperature and position. They did not default to a safe state. So some of their temperatures went all the way up as high as possible. Some of them wound up in really uncomfortable, not even, shapes that you could sit in or whatever. And they stayed that way until the systems were fixed. All that is to illustrate that as we're moving more and more of the processing capability of components to the edge, but they're relying too much on centralized control and that kind of stuff, that we really need to get smarter about how we're governing the systems and governing the data that informs all that kind of stuff. And Kavya just pointed out too that the Waymo had some issues with that just recently too, where they had a bunch of cars in San Francisco related to power outages that lost access to the system, and so started behaving. I can't remember if they all just stopped or they just started acting weird, but yeah, they caused definitely some problems there. So really, that's kind of at the heart of this is that governance before, as I mentioned, it's not just around the administrative human side of talking about these things and making decisions, but it's actually about implementing them in a way where the governance needed to manage these things appropriately exists at the point at which the data is being used and where the data exists, whether that's on the edge device itself or on the cloud systems that are dealing with it and in between. So immersive infrastructures are tied to all that too. So we're not just talking about, I mean, if ubiquitous access is necessary and ubiquitous data access and processing is necessary, even in asynchronous ways, we're reliant on broader technologies. So, 5G for wireless data, potentially globally, or satellite-based connectivity these days, data processing at the edge. We're relying on a connection of non-user interactive sensors, whether we're talking about machine-to-machine or vehicle-to-vehicle communication on the road, or whether we're talking about, newer cars have the ability to receive broadcast signals and use radar to detect things like, speed limit signs and what the speed limits on roads are and how the road shape is changing and mapping systems and stuff like that. We talked a little bit before about some of the smart city kind of interaction capabilities, whether we're talking about navigation or touring or other experiences there, or autonomous systems. The goal really is that we recognize too that it's not just the technology that humans are directly interacting with in XR, AR spaces, but maybe there's a lot of machine to machine and a lot of other forms of automation that are also part of this ecosystem that has to be incorporated into this processes. So building trust with these systems isn't just around having the data governed just because the user is interacting with them. We need to make sure that the user feels safe and feels seen and feels trusted related to use of technology, but that as these things are being integrated into the very environments and infrastructure that people are existing within or navigating around, that they can have the same kinds of trust with how the data and interactions with them within those systems are going to be handled. I think maybe the classic example here is speed cameras on the road. Do you have trust that the cameras, I mean, most people probably implicitly understand that the cameras have to be accurate, and if you get caught, speeding or something, that the chances are you can believe in the judgment of, the local law enforcement agency that's kind of seeing that ticket or whatever else. But that's just kind of one really early example of what that kind of automated decision making and now expand that to all the myriad of systems we have today, and even the idea that the trustability of the data that's being collected and generated in the first place is itself now in question in a lot of cases. So we want to provide a way to help maybe ease that burden a bit and it kind of restore confidence in those systems so that the advantages that we all want to take from these systems can actually be realized. Which kind of gets to the next point here. I mean, really, we're talking about governing the ungovernable. Traditional governance models are based on humans making a decision at one point. Going back to that speed camera, I grew up in a jurisdiction where, by law, the officer, an actual police officer or law enforcement officer, had to observe the infraction in order to be able to write a ticket for it. So when they first started putting in speed cameras, they were fully automated. A lot of them got thrown out of court and actually really humorously had to install them in minivans and have an actual police officer sitting in the van with the camera so that he could witness the stuff, which was all kind of funny, of course, and led to changes in rules. But the idea is that where we have to rely on an individual being present, a human being present to make the decisions all the time, is simply not scalable. It's not performative enough. It does not perform fast enough, nor is it more than just performative. And so we need to have frameworks for ensuring adherence to whatever governance framework, whatever governance structure that we've put in place that exists at the point the data is being dealt with. And that's something that's baked into our standard, whether we're talking about those high volume, high velocity biometric data streams being captured by VR and AR equipment, whether we're talking about AI generated insights and decision making and recommendations based on data processing or someone's interaction within physical spaces, or virtual spaces, whether we're talking about the fact that data, in order to provide those features, is being shared with folks who may not be in the same jurisdiction or the same country or have the same perspectives and considerations for the data that you're collecting or dealing with, and all that. We need to make sure that can be done relying on as much automation and as much adherence to the governance and standards and rules that we have in place and that we need, regardless of where that information ultimately winds up. Specific integration with some of the other crossover or related kind of SDOs here at MSF. We recognize that there's definitely uses in things like OpenXR, and some of these standard. I know there's been some changes over time, so some of these terms might be a little outdated, but this is what we had when we started doing this originally. But data governance around what sensors are gathering about individuals as part of OpenXR. So having baked-in classification, having baked-in runtime enforcement, and clear guidance for how the data should be gathered, what's being gathered, what can be used, when more consent is needed from the user before you're doing more things. All that kind of stuff is part of the governance standard. Asset provenance. So trying to bake in the idea that governance at the time, adherence to, as I said before, these standards are versioned as well. So if you create a device that's adherent to 2025 V1, and 2 years later you make a different device that's adherent to 2027 V2, you can help communicate, the fact that it meets the RDG standard in the first place, but also how specific that is. Who's going to know the difference between the versions? That's referenceable, but the idea there is really that you can ensure that the governance standard, the expectations, capabilities are packaged with the device, travel with it, however it lives, wherever it lives, for as long as it lives, and that can be extended into virtual, assets as well. Whether we're talking about like metadata changes or schema changes or providing aspects for that, the governance and the adherence to those rules can be baked in, can follow the asset as opposed to having to rely on access to a backend system to make decisions for it. We can talk about embedded governance in systems where we can embed validators. And this kind of gets at the idea that, as we said many times, baking in automation and trying to make it so that the only way to do things is the right way to do things, and providing a framework to encourage and support the adoption of that, throughout, end to end, handling and processing of the data and kind of stuff is something baked into our framework. And really this all gets down to supporting interoperability. We said many times that the goal of the standard is to help organizations implement data governance to achieve or help to answer some of those trustability issues that we talked about before, some of those confidence issues before, but anyway, it doesn't get in the way of your ability to integrate with others and kind of share that provide those services and adopt them in a safe way. So we're going to finish with some specific column use cases, column examples. There's going to be 3 of them, but we're talking around specific challenges related to extended reality technologies that RDG can help support or help make easier. So the first one is kind of the obvious one, which is shared multi-user VR or AR environment. So you've got multiple users, let's say there's 8 maybe in a virtual space, all in a shared VR space, each of them generating that huge volume of biometric data about those individuals, where they live, how they're interacting with physical space and the virtual space. And there's controls there around, or there's concerns there around what data is being captured about the individuals, what it's being used for. Is data being supplied to the VR experience provider that is not related to what they're doing in VR, and what should that organization do with it? Do they care if an individual falls down and collapses, for example? Does the equipment need to do something about that? How do we handle all that? Those are key concerns here. What information about each individual's physical space or biometric characteristics or physiological characteristics may be shared with the other individuals in that space, that should be shared with other individuals in that space, that could be inferred by other individuals in that space, or their gear or automated things tied to it, and so on. So those are all, some examples of stuff that we've all been dealing with since, some of those were part of the reasons the MSF was created in the first place, as I recall correctly, right? So dealing with some of that kind of stuff, RDG, the specific elements of RDG that overlap there. Mapping all the data life cycles and who owns the data, where it's coming from, that kind of stuff is encompassed in goal 1. Setting the clear roles for what those expectations are, who's responsible for the data, who should be handling the data, what they're allowed and should be doing with it, and how they be kept accountable with what they're doing with it. In other words, if the experience provider is only supposed to be using a subset of the information for facilitating interactions with the individuals in that space, but it turns out they're gathering data they shouldn't be, what should happen from that? How do we deal with that? That's all part of goal 2. The third-party agreements and flow diagrams, who they're sharing the data with. Is it just them? What other organizations are they depending on to provide that virtual environment? Are their data providers and that kind of stuff involved? Are the device vendors involved because the data is going through the device vendor before it gets to the VR space or something like that? That's a show will be incorporated as part of goal 4. And then, is there AI, being involved in the space? Is it making decisions around adjustments to and how to display the virtual space? Is it having to, fragment generation and exhibition of the virtual space based on the physical or the pseudo-physical interactions with the individuals that are in the space in terms of how far apart they are? Kind of this is a bit of a niche example, but sometimes in the show Star Trek: The Next Generation, they have those virtual rooms called holosuites or holodecks. Anyway, it's a finite room, but when you have multiple people in there, different places, it has to kind of separate which part of it different people are in to display different things at the same time. Similar aspects happen in virtual space where you may have what elements of it are being showed to different users at different points, and maybe using AI to kind of figure out what that should look like. Anyway, long story short, or to say that aspect is also incorporated in Goal 5. Those are just a few examples here. The idea here, that the real results is maybe as part of applying RDG, you recognize that, well, maybe we need enclaves per user so that we're more tightly controlling the information that we're getting about them and which elements of it are shared with the systems providing aspects of the virtual environment to the users, so that we can ensure that there isn't even access to data that could be misused, let alone, trying to misuse some of it. Maybe we can abstract a lot of that data away from the system, so they don't necessarily need to know more than which room a person is in order to display the experience, but they don't need to know maybe where in the room the person is, so we don't provide that information, that kind of stuff. The goal and the goal here is that all that results in there being no user or regulator complaints around how the information about the images gathered maybe in the last 12 months or something like that, for example, and that's because RDG was implemented and adhered to within that environment. The next example, industrial twinning or digital twinning. So let's say that this is a process being used on a factory floor, maybe 150 sensors. We've got AI at the edge. We've got XR visualization of the space. And maybe what we're looking here is, we're tracking, what's going through assembly lines or production lines, or, maybe it's a shipping or picking aspect. Maybe there's interaction with robots in the space, something like that. How do we ensure that we can get solid governance, all that kind of stuff, and all the systems integrate? Because the systems that are responsible for the assembly lines, for the packaging lines, for the individuals in the space, for the robots in the space, they're probably all provided by third parties who may or may not even be aware of each other in the environment, but somebody in the organization should be aware of all that kind of stuff. So if we're applying controls in this situation, maybe there's hundreds of data points in the environment and data being gathered that we've mapped and classified based on where it's coming from, who's touching it, where it's going, how sensitive it is, who's it about, what's it about, all that kind of stuff. We've actually got that inventoried and mapped and data flowed and controlled. We've got role-based accountability and access set up. What the managers can view of things going through the space may be different than what gets aggregated to the executives, and maybe different than what's available to the folks on the floor. Maybe managers need to know where which robots are needing to stop and go have their batteries charged, which ones are still capable, where physically they are in the space, how they're interacting with workers within the space, which workers are how long each worker has been on their feet, who needs a break, who's coming up for that, who's clocked out for whatever reason, that kind of stuff, versus what the executives care about, which is, how many robots were out of commission that day, how many individuals, needed more time because they're working too hard for organization, if there are, impacts to our ability to do process in the line because maybe a robot got stuck in a processing machine or something. I mean, who knows what, but it's really just ensuring that the data that needs to be available to each of those audiences or each of those stakeholders at a given time, but only the data needed to provide the information they need is available when it's there, and that it can be provided in a managed, governed way. Same thing with the vendors involved in that space. One of the classic kind of sins in information technology going back. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years, and it extends beyond that. Vendors often get a lot more data about their devices and the environments that their devices live in than they actually need to provide support. And so maybe we need to start controlling that a bit more. Maybe my robot vacuum does not need to be transmitting the map that it developed of my house to the company that I bought the thing from. Maybe they need an aggregated version to help improve their AI models. They're developing the map, but they don't actually need to know where my bathroom is if they're living in New York or China or India or wherever they are. And so providing a consideration for that, and public government should mention that can be really important. Idea results here, getting through faster audits because you've got the information the auditors need, faster vendor onboarding because you know exactly where they plug in the environment, where they say what data they need and what data they're providing you. And that the goal here is that because RDG is in place, because governance has been in there, you've been able to get to the point where there's been zero data breaches, intentional, unintentional, or even breaches that aren't necessarily harmful, but that just involve more information getting out that needed to be, that you've been able to eliminate that through the governance of that data within the environment across all of these myriad disconnected systems for maybe the last 18 months. And that's an example of an ideal kind of like, we have RDG, therefore this is something we were able to accomplish. And finally, I forgot to change the title here. Apologize that shouldn't say industrial twin. That should say robotic assisted surgery. But the goal here is that, let's say we're using AR in a healthcare space to assist with surgery or assist with, doing diagnostics and that kind of stuff. And so maybe the provider is wearing a headset, getting real information about the patient, about the current exam. Maybe they're getting real-time imaging. Maybe they're getting diagnostic suggestions from the AI kind of, that coach on the shoulder kind of stuff. So what would RDG do in this case? Well, making sure that data being governed appropriately, from its full life cycle, collection, processing, how long we need to store the data, 7 years on average for business stuff. It could be longer. I mean, in the healthcare space, at least within my state and most of the US, if you're dealing with data related to like implantable devices, you have to keep it for the lifetime of the patient. If it's things related to minors, you have to keep it for 10 years after the day they turn 18, for example. And so you have to kind of know that based on the aspects of the data you're collecting. If it's related to an individual procedure, what is necessary to be kept in the long term within the patient record, what's only needed within the scope of that interaction at the time. How are we being sure that those kind of limits and aspects are being incorporated into, not just the solution, but the implementation and use of the things at the time? Are we logging everything that needs to be done related to the AI modeling, the confidence? Do we need to keep some of that information so that we can answer questions related to, misdiagnosis or malpractice down the road, or even just improving outcomes and that kind of stuff? What of that should be kept for those purposes? And if we are keeping it for those purposes, how long did we remember to get consent from the patient for those kind of purposes, and so on? And then how we map to the regulatory goals that are required here, like HIPAA, like FDA controls, like sensitive data handling under GDPR maybe, or the individual requirements of the health regulators within other countries. Ideal results in this kind of scenario is being able to rely on the governance structure itself as part of providing support for achieving clearance from FDA or whatever the regulator that's needed to get our systems out there, that this encourages broad adoption, or at least good initial adoption of the technologies that we've developed for this kind of stuff. Maybe we get our first robot into, or our first AR system here into 12 different hospitals supporting 200 plus surgeons. Those numbers are wildly crazy. It's just the point really is maybe this could help ease that path to regulatory approval, ease that path to adoption, kind of getting back to that restoring trust in the systems. And maybe the other ideal result of this is because we've implemented this responsible data governance, because we've implemented, answered a lot of those questions like we were talking about, we've been able to get to the point where we've had zero violations, not even breaches, but just not even violations of our privacy requirements or portability requirements for the last 24 months or something else. That's just, kind of illustrating the idea there. All right. Thank you very much for all of your time and for listening. As I said at the beginning, I tend to get really excited about this stuff and talk very, very fast. Thankfully, this is recorded, so if you want to play it again at half speed, you can. If you want more information around XRSI or RDG itself, you can go to xrsi.org/RDG. You can also go to cautelare.com, CAUTELARE.com. That's our initial certifying body for RDG, to get some more information on the process there. Feel free to reach out to info@xrsi.org. And to reiterate a point that Leonard mentioned earlier too, just like MSF, XRSI is an organization largely dependent on volunteer contributors as well too. So if you have interest in our standards of what we're doing as well, please feel free to reach out. Please feel free to get involved. And we need help with people who are willing to help and get engaged on this, who are as passionate as I am about this stuff, or as Kavi is, and get involved in whatever way seems appropriate for you and your organization, whether it's direct involvement, assist with standards, or sponsorship. We're happy for all of that.
Thank you, Jordan, for the presentation today. And also thank you, Kavya, for stepping in and addressing a few of the very key points here. I have one question before we'll start the open Q&A. And during the open Q&A, it's sufficient to raise your hand, but do wait until you're called upon. And my question is, how do individuals, not part of organizations, but individuals as data generators, go about and seeing how this can be more implemented, or that there's better data governance throughout the systems and the devices they have to deal with?
That's a great question, and I would say there are multiple aspects I think that could be relevant there. So one, as the individual data supplier, let's say you are, if you're talking about system that you as an individual providing out there, one of the things that you could be doing is looking for the XRSI RDG trust mark on the systems that you're supplying data to, so that you know it's being handled in the way that you expect and would agree with, and you know that they're governing it appropriately. If you're an individual developing systems that's going to be sharing data or collecting that kind of data, one, you could be looking for systems that bear the trust mark so that you'd be sharing the data with them and know that they're handling it appropriately. You should also have a copy of the standard yourself for understanding kind of what the framework is and how you should be governing that data and baking in that governance to the system that you're developing to do that, so that you can be not just aligned with making sure the data is being handled that way, but so that you have ready answers to the questions and some of the integration stuff from the partners you might be sharing the data with and to the individuals that you may be gathering the data from. As we talked about before, this is really about getting back to encouraging and developing that trust ecosystem, and aspects of RDG would apply to any of those areas. The standard itself is built on 7 goals with those 25 requirements. Like I said, it's not overly arduous. It's really about it's a framework to help ensure that those aspects can be handled. And so I think that applies whether you're an individual contributor, somebody supplying data, or looking for integration into larger organizations and product lines as well.
Thank you. So are there any other questions? Anybody would like to raise their hand and ask something? So we'll continue going for a little ways. If you have a question, please raise your hand. In the interim, we'll start the wrap up here.
And as we said before, if anybody, if something occurs to you later, feel free to reach out, info@xrsi.org, or you can reach the folks at the certifying body if your questions are more technical on that side too. And again, that's at caudallaria.com.
So as indicated, put the questions in Zoom chat or raise your hand. But before you leave, we'd like to know how the forum can help with these SDO sessions. And in particular, we have a short, I believe it's 7-question survey here. You can link to the QR code or through the link that'll be posted in chat in just a moment. And we would really like people to fill out this survey because it does help guide us into what other sessions we hold in the future. So the next session that is scheduled is Geospatial Standards to Address the Requirements of Real-World Use Cases. It's March 11th. That's about 6 weeks from now. You can get to it through the register button if you happen to get a copy of the slides. So you can also go to the event listing link here, or you can click on the chat link there. This is presented by people from the Open Geospatial Consortium and other organizations. And before we call for finals, any last questions? Well, thank you for attending today. We'll post everything to the forum website as indicated, either the YouTube links or other places. There will be a copy of all the slide sets, both mine, which is not the really important ones, and Jordan's, which is the important ones. Please consider joining the forum. Again, I mentioned that it's open to all organizations, including governments and educational institutions, not individuals, but if you have a business, that counts. And there are tiered levels. You can join as a principal, which requires payments of varying amounts depending upon your organization size, for as little as $50 if you're a single person organization. Or you can join as a participant, and that does not cost anything. So watch out for the future SDO special sessions. They'll be posted in the same places that you saw this one. And as if you are an SDO or representing an SDO or participating in SDO, please contact us if you'd like to participate in a special session. And the QR code again is to the survey form. Please fill that out. Again, let's thank Jordan and Kavya from XRSI for the presentation of the Responsible Data Governance framework and their new standard.